Right, hello and welcome to the Keep Learning podcast. My name is Alicja Zyska.
And I'm Matthew Mesley.
And today we are talking about the imposter syndrome. And this is very timely, Matthew, because recently you've been working on developing a guide to an imposter syndrome. So it should be a really nice kind of complementary conversation about it, because I bet you have lots of thoughts and ideas that came up to you and informed how you think about imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I think I've always had a sort of idea of what imposter syndrome is, and I've also felt it myself in the past. But certainly, researching for a student guide on imposter syndrome made me think about it. Made me think about it in different ways, and also from different perspectives as well that I hadn't really sort of thought about previously. So hopefully, we can talk about that a little bit more in the rest of the podcast. But I know that you had some history about imposter syndrome and why it's called that.
Yeah, so the term was originally developed in 1978 by psychologists. And the study from which the term arose was focused on high achieving women. And the idea was to kind of find out why, despite them really being accomplished and phenomenal as women professionally, they still believe that they're not bright enough, that they're frauds, that people think that they're cleverer and better than they actually are. So from this research, people started investigating it within leadership, within business situations and environments, corporations, etc. So actually, initially, the whole idea was focused on women. And the very name of it, the imposter syndrome, I think is very consequential in terms of how we think about it, because a syndrome indicates some level of medicalization or pathologizing of maybe something that could be fairly normal as a feeling. So the feeling of anxiety, the feeling of discomfort or not fitting in the environment where we operate, that should be normal. But once we call it a syndrome, it becomes something else.
Yeah, it's definitely a problematic term, isn't it? And I think, but it's difficult, isn't it? Because it's almost, you can't really get away from the term, the term that's in use. But yeah, I think what you said about it being, I mean, particularly if you are a woman or a minority and you're in an environment where there aren't, many role models, or, you might be one of the few people like you. I think that can be quite normal, but I think sometimes it seems like the emphasis is almost like it's your fault rather than something that you're perhaps reacting against. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I think actually, we just started a can of worms. It's like opening a can of worms, because there are so many issues that I feel compelled to talk about. So let's leave this whose fault it is for later, because I really want to pick it up. But maybe we could just one more minute on the label itself, because if you had a chance to rename it, to call it something else, would you? what do you think it would be?
Oh God!
Because what kind of encapsulates the feeling for you?
I don't know. Maybe like being an outsider, or something. Well, I suppose feeling like you're an outsider when actually you're completely competent. And often it's because you are like at a high level, like you said, that you're feeling like that. But I don't know, would something like outsider be something that would work? Or
yeah, I think it's a good one, because unless you embrace it, you are bound to always feel this uncomfortable. as an outsider. So I think outsider is a good one. If my alternative is maybe not as profound as thinking about it this way, but to me, an imposter syndrome is like a monkey. It's like a monkey.
Monkey syndrome.
Monkey
well, hopefully you wouldn't have the syndrome as part of it anymore, but
yeah, but it's like this kind of monkey that nags you and that tells you you're not good enough, but actually you can kind of brush it off your shoulder if you notice that it's there, but not noticing that it's there, and kind of not recognizing the undermining work that it's doing, the kind of silly monkey brain work that it's doing, is what causes it to stay where it is and do the damage. Anyway, I just thought maybe we could look at it differently than.
I think it's a good idea to question though the term itself, and whether there are ways of thinking about it. But it's the problem, isn't it, when it's a word that is so like recognized and understood. Yeah, I think it's important to unpick or challenge the term and perhaps question some of the assumptions that people can have about it.
Yeah, I think the more you speak about it, the more you can actually maybe even brush it off your shoulder, like that monkey or whatever it is. Because science actually tells us, that analyzing issues and talking about them really helps to demystify them. So let's demystify this imposter syndrome for a moment and think about it in terms of how it manifests itself. So like when you talk to students, what do you see as a kind of pattern in terms of where you're like, this sounds like an imposter syndrome?
I think the first thing is where you're in a group, or you're doing your MA or your PhD and you're looking at other people around you, and you might feel that they seem much more with it and together, or more articulate or experienced, and then you start to question yourself in like comparison to other people. I think that can be definitely an issue.
Yeah, and you mentioned MA and PhD students, but actually I hear it a lot from undergraduate students as well, who basically, it's interesting how if they heard what other students say, they would hear the same story, because it's that story of I'm not good enough, or others are way ahead, they have it together. Yeah, it's just me constantly catching up or constantly being behind and not understanding. But that's not the case, or it's rarely the case. And in fact, I think there's a number on how many people experience that feeling, which is 70% of society, isn't it? So, and if it's 70% of society, I suppose it's a higher number in academia than anywhere else, because this kind of maybe competitive environment or environment where we're constantly invited to be in uncomfortable situation because we are learning from nothing. It's uncomfortable not to know things and having to learn new things. So I suppose that probably most of our students experience some form or another of that feeling that others are doing so much better than I am.
Yeah, and I think this is just a quick sidebar, I suppose, but I think that sometimes it can be about how they've experienced education prior to university. And I know, for instance, I had one student, for instance, come up to me and say, oh, it was great that that feedback you gave me, because that's the first time anyone said that was a good point to me. Which is horrible. Like, it's awful to have that, have that. But I think, it's important, to have that positive feedback element.
It goes back to our conversation about feedback, where we talked about how it's important to balance, the positives and negatives. And I think that we sometimes fail to remember how important it may be to an individual student to hear a confirmation that they have done something well before we even make suggestions about how they could do even better in their assignments.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I think that obviously, we can I internalize, sort of opinions about how we study or how we write, for instance. I mean, that's another thing that I think some students think that, you know, that their writing isn't good compared to other students, and, you know, that it takes so long to write something maybe coherent or articulate. But I can tell you now, that's something that I still suffer with. Yes. And I think it's one of the things is to sort of almost recognize that, you know, this is something that even writers, you know, professional writers struggle with. You know, that you're not instantly going to have good writing. It takes time and practice, I suppose. I don't know.
Yeah, but you know what you mentioned about internalizing this negativity or negative feedback, I think is really important, because what happens to people who experience this feeling of imposterism is that they internalize this negative feedback, but they never internalize positive feedback. So they never internalize praise. Praise is something you get, but you don't deserve. So you brush it off and move on to the next thing and the next thing. And so there is this paradox within imposterism that actually is the high achievers, right? Those people who actually care, those students who care, who experience it because they have that ambition of performing well, but at the same time, they never feel like that they deserve the praise that they receive.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, and I have an inkling that I may have felt that myself. Yes. in the past too. I think it's also because particularly high achieving students, they, you know, they might not necessarily count something as being successful or being something that is worthy, when actually it can be, like, you know, and that sometimes it's about recognizing the little things that you've done towards something, or the little achievements that you've done, and they're not necessarily little either. I don't know whether you think that.
I mean, confession time. I'm that person too. I have hard time acknowledging my achievements, or an achievement happens and then I quickly move on. It's like, okay, it happened. Well, you know, it was nothing, obviously. I mean, it really didn't require effort.
Because you're always thinking, what next?
Exactly. What next? But also, it's just not giving yourself the time to celebrate, you know, what you accomplished. And gosh, I don't know how to change it and how to even suggest to anyone else to change it. But I will always tell people I talk to, my students, you know, do spend that time celebrating your accomplishment. Just acknowledge them, look at them, say to yourself, well done, pat yourself on the back. And, you know, if you can't do it for yourself, do it for me, because I can't do it.
Yeah, and I think that's another important thing, isn't it? It's I think it's much easier to celebrate other people's success sometimes than it is to celebrate our own. Like, and I know, for instance, that I've had sort of, you know, I'm being, you know, my publication notification or something like that, and I'll mention it to my partner, and he'll be like, "So are we celebrating tonight?" And I'm like, oh yeah, but it's just a kind of thing.
It's just that's the kind of phrase that should be punished.
I know. So I do wonder then whether we're the best people to speak on this.
Well, you know, talking about, I mean, we're not pretending to be experts on the imposter syndrome, but we have experienced it. We work with people who experience it. We constantly see it around ourselves. So the conversation is not about providing people with solutions, but more about understanding how it works.
And I think, at least we've got to that stage where we can recognize it. And I think that's important. And also to articulate it. And then, because I think by that, if you started doing that, you can then think about what you can do to maybe push against it or cope with it or change it.
So now you actually are saying something really important as well. I think that, you know, the feeling can be very subjective, right? And we are in charge of doing something about it. The change begins with us, right? But it actually doesn't necessarily end with us, right? It can be a very real feeling. It may not be just a subjective perception. When issues such as, let's say, deliberate exclusion are factored in, or some, I don't know, microaggressions by, people who make insensitive remarks around us that make us feel uncomfortable. So actually people can plant it in us. So, what this Harvard Business Review article we read recently, there was something, do you remember which one I'm talking about?
Yeah, it was talking about the intersections between gender and race as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, so there was really something really interesting that Ruchika Tulsian said in it, and something that annoys me as well about the imposter syndrome, that the onus is often on the individual who experiences it to change it, right? And sometimes it's okay because the work indeed begins with us. So we do have to interrogate how we relate to our environment and how we find our place in it. But sometimes the environment itself is constructed in a way that is almost designed to make us feel small and inadequate. Yeah, so to question ourselves and to feel uncomfortable, like we don't fit in. So in fact, there are two issues here for me. The first one is, do you think it's good that we have a name for it? As we said before, that something otherwise quite normal is presented as this problem, and we can pin it down as an issue. And two, do you think more attention should be paid to the context generating this feeling than to the individuals?
Oh, these are difficult questions. I think I can answer the second one, I think, reasonably well, in the sense of saying, yes, I think that's really important. Although practically it's difficult to know how as an individual you can do that. But I think it's about, for instance, making sure or getting involved in your community or your academic field and making sure that, that there isn't gatekeeping, that it is like, that there is a sort of push for inclusivity and things like that, so that people do feel welcomed, and that they don't have to be the ones that are always sort of the ones vocalizing that they're always the one trying to seek change to some extent, if that makes sense.
It does, and it almost feels so. Yes, I know that we can't necessarily change institutions from like, oh well, there's no magical switch we can use to change an institution, but in fact we are the institutions, right? We are part of this. So if we can, let's say, change the way we even interact with others by confirming or affirming them, in the same way we would need affirmation from the others, it's almost like creating a change from within, that understanding that this is an issue and 70% of us experience it, if not more. Then we could help each other by just having that awareness and acting on it.
I think it would be nice if it was more like it was more of a because I think often imposter syndrome, there's almost sort of like some sort of shame or embarrassment attached to it, and it's not necessarily vocalized or talked about or put out there. And maybe if there was that kind of more open attitude to it, a more sort of like recognition that this exists and that this is something that people suffer from. I think, with that awareness, it could. I think that's a first step, isn't it? Perhaps in an institutional context. Where could it go though from that? I'm not sure.
I mean, I think I'm being very idealistic here. It's more like thinking along the lines of, instead of thinking this is something people suffer from, saying this is something we suffer from, and therefore kind of owning it. And if we know that most people around us, or let's say, I don't know, colleagues around us, students around us, do have it to one extent or another, then that awareness can change the way we interact or respond to...
I like that idea. Hopefully you're seeing some kind of that. But I suppose you need to be, there needs to be people constantly working for that, isn't there? And sometimes people are more committed to that than others, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what? Recently, someone said to me that the imposter syndrome can be a good thing. And instantly, I was all ears, like, how can it be a good thing? And it was... the remark was made in the context of leadership training, leadership of women in particular. And the person said that the imposter syndrome always happens when you enter new places. So it's always part of trying and learning new things. And also, when you look at it this way, entering new places means that you are growing and developing, right? That these new places, in fact, are these kind of gateways to your future. So when you are experiencing it, it means it's good because you're in a new place. It means you're growing, and so get used to that. Looking at it as a good thing. I don't know if it makes sense, but actually it really helped me to think about, okay, so imposter syndrome, that means I'm a trailblazer somewhere, here or there. And it doesn't always work, but in some situations it can work.
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about it. The way that you explained it, it does make it's got a nice, I suppose it has nice connotations, although there's something about it that makes my skin crawl a little bit in terms of like making things that can be quite debilitating positive. But talking about all things positive, the object of the week I brought today is something very special to me. This is my mug, which you have seen before, so it's not a surprise. But I think within a sort of university role, and as a sort of I suppose in my prior life as an academic, I think it was important. I think it's important. This sort of reminds me about how it is important to sort of to love yourself, I suppose, even though I am hugely cynical most of the time. But I think it's important because sometimes we can, I mean, in academia, we often are after sort of external validation, even if that's, through sort of, publications, presentations, things like that. And sometimes, and this is, I think, related to sometimes how we can feel with imposter syndrome, we need to sort of say to ourselves, yeah, we are good enough to be here, or we are, worth it, kind of thing. So I like this as a kind of, and also it's from one of my favorite sitcoms too, as well.
Which one is it?
Modern Families.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So, which I would definitely recommend. But yes, I think it's good to have that moment.
Yeah, amazing, great. Well, I can't resist asking you. So you thought, "Ooh, imposter syndrome. Ooh, I need a mug." It wasn't like that, was it?
No. No, I mean, it was mainly because it's my favorite sitcom, but I think it does sort of represent the feeling that you need sometimes with it, as a student, or as an academic, or as someone that works in the university, just to love yourself, basically, even though that sounds cringing to some extent. But I don't know what you think.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't got a mug like this.
I'm gonna have to buy you one. No, don't worry, I won't.
My mug says Canadian polar bear in snowstorm. That's my mug. But it's I think it's a great representation of...
I'm gonna keep it up.
Good. Of how, paradoxical it all is, because you have a PhD, and it's not the PhD diploma that you put in front of your face to look at it every day to give you that sense of worth, but it's a mug that will do that job. It's amazing.
Well, I'm not saying that this is giving me my self-worth. I think it's nice it's just a nice little sort of thought, isn't it? To just to be kind to yourself, I think. And that's something that I think we forget, maybe, particularly in an academic context sometimes.
Certainly.
But yeah, but again, I suppose, I wouldn't necessarily need to look at the PhD every day.
So if you, so what are the kinds of circumstances where you would have experienced this syndrome?
Well, I suppose the first time that I felt it in a big way is doing my master's at Cambridge, and that was like a sort of a bit of a system shock to me, in terms of, I suppose, expectations, but also because I suppose we've talked about it a little bit, but also sometimes it's not about what you know, but it's also about sort of the particular culture of a place or an environment. And if you don't have those kind of unwritten norms or sort of cultural knowledge, sometimes that is expected of you, you're kind of perhaps deemed like less of. So I think that can be difficult, and I think that is definitely a problem within both certain university and academic contexts. I don't know what you think.
And it's again that idea of being an outsider, right? And when you start adding up everything that goes against you, maybe your sex, age, ability, experience, ethnic origin, status, accent, whatever it is, you can find it difficult to interpret it as maybe your uniqueness or your amazing contribution to that group that you're within, but everything kind of seems to go against you, right? And mark you as that person that doesn't belong, and therefore reinforce that idea of the imposter syndrome. So I've had my fair share of these as well, because I've lived in different countries and studied in different countries and at different levels as well. So, funnily enough, I experienced the imposter syndrome once in an environment where I should have felt superior, maybe, but so I'll tell you the detail. When I went to America, I already had my master's degree, but in order to study for a PhD, I needed some credits to translate my master's and in a Polish institution for the American university. So I went to a community college to take some courses there, and so there I was in my late 20s in a community college with mostly 18-year-olds, and I already had my master's, and that was the beginning of their journey. And yet I felt like an imposter, because I was this foreigner who spoke in a funny way, and who didn't have maybe enough vocabulary at that time yet, and who just was kind of a weirdo in a group that was pretty solid and pretty uniform. So it can be an experience in so many different ways, and you still constantly, I felt like a fraud. I felt like I constantly had to prove myself to that group as someone who belongs. So it's kind of it's very strange how it can manifest itself in so many different situations. And in fact, it almost feels like it doesn't matter what the situation, what the context is. It's more how you interpret it and what you make of it, isn't it?
I think sometimes you can internalize things that you've had from one situation, unfortunately, sort of like almost like bring it along to another situation, if that makes sense.
So we didn't want to make it especially positive in our conversation. We had different ideas about it. I think it still helps me to think of it as a monkey that I can brush off and but at least look it in the eye and kind of see, I know you're here, I know you're doing this, it's not me, it's just that feeling. But are there any tried and tested ways of dealing with it that you've
well, I suppose if, with the caveat obviously that we don't want it that it shouldn't necessarily all be down to the individual. Again, I suppose what I found useful, and I think in my research as well, it's something that comes up a lot, it's kind of some of, I suppose it might seem quite basic, but it's sort of one of the things is sort of reaching out and talking to other people about it and like vocalizing how you're feeling. Obviously that depends on having people that are empathetic or who can understand, I suppose, your position or what you're sort of facing. And I suppose the other thing is also trying to acknowledge your successes, for instance, a lot more, and also celebrating them too, which I think is really important. And as I said, I'm glad I've got my partner there to do that sometimes. I suppose there are other ways as well that you can it's sometimes about framing things, isn't it? So instead of sort of framing something in perhaps a really negative way, trying to sort of bring some light into it, to bring a sort of like positive angle. And I think I've definitely in the past tried to do that when I feel like I've got an uphill struggle with a piece of work, because I just thinking to myself, look, this might feel horrible at the moment, but it's just gonna get there through every time you come back to something, it's gonna get better. So I don't know what kind of things you have found to be useful.
Yeah, quite similar. I think talking about it helps, which is great that we're talking about it. But just for me, most issues I ever have or experience, I deal with by just recognizing them. So once I'm aware that this is happening and I understand why it's happening, I find it much easier to deal with and to find solutions for myself, or just recognize, I know this is you, imposter syndrome. I know it's you, monkey. It's not, because I think the worst is if we just listen to all these crazy thoughts that we constantly have in our head and accept them as real reflections of reality. This is just how things are. Well, no, this is what our brain makes us want to think, and it has all these crazy thoughts. And recognizing that this is just a thought and you are not your thoughts helped me personally to deal with it and just take the situation for what it actually is.
Yeah. Oh, one thing that also where I like about that, about sort of recognizing it. Another thing that I've done in the past, I don't know if you've done this as well, is if I'm sort of like thinking, everything I write is terrible, everything is horrible, I'll look at something that's been published in the past by myself, or I'll read something that I had really good feedback from, and then you're like, oh, actually I can write, or actually I can, this does make sense, actually I think this is quite a good point.
That's a double-edged sword though, because I have read in the past things that I had written, and I was like, oh, I would have written it differently now. So it can work both ways, I think.
For me, I think it's just like, if you can see that you've done something, and that it did get to that point of being published, or it did get to that point where you had really good feedback, or a good mark or whatever, then it's like, well, you did it then, you can do it now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely.
But I understand the point of looking back on really old work and going, I wouldn't have written it like that, but
but I think in the spirit of this podcast, we really have to accept that this feeling of discomfort and being a fraud is always going to arise, always going to happen when we learn new things, when we are doing new things. And that's the nature of learning. So it's almost like it's always going to be there. It's just about coping with it or finding ways that work for us individually to acknowledge, to recognize, and to brush off and move on, or maybe flip it as something positive if it works for someone else.
And I think knowing that 70% of other people feel like this already makes you feel a little bit like, like that. At least I'm not the only one, kind of thing.
And I would hazard a guess that there is actually more than 70%, because we all have experienced self-doubt. I mean, I can't imagine a person who hasn't. There probably are, but but at some point or another, people do experience self-doubt, do experience this kind of discomfort. So it's probably even more, but maybe not necessarily named.
But, you know, remember, everyone, you can buy a mug. Everything can be fixed. So
everything can be fixed.
We should end that on that positive note.
Buy a mug and keep learning.
Keep learning.
Yeah. Thank you very much for listening, for your attention, and for being part of this conversation, because it's actually your stories and experiences that allow us to do what we do. So thank you.
Yeah, and feel free to subscribe on our iTunes, and also to watch us. And also, you can review us too, but only 5 stars, please. And you can also watch us on YouTube channel as well.
Indeed. Until next time.
Keep learning.
Bye.